The night my husband told me he wanted a divorce, I smiled. Not the kind of smile people wear when they're fine, but the kind that fits too perfectly, like a mask you've practiced for years. We were seated at our usual spot in the dining room, a table long enough to make conversation optional, set with food neither of us planned to eat. Daniel was wearing his navy suit, the one he wore when he wanted to feel powerful. His voice was calm, measured, as though he were presenting an architectural blueprint rather than dismantling a marriage. "Evelyn," he said, cutting his steak into exact squares, "I think we've outgrown each other." I looked up from my glass of wine, tilting my head just enough to appear thoughtful. "Outgrown," I repeated softly, "like a pair of shoes." He smiled, that condescending, rehearsed smile he saved for interns and wives. "You deserve more than this," he continued, as if reciting from a handbook on guilt-free cruelty. "I've met someone and I don't want to hurt you by pretending." Ah, there it was, the someone. They always say that like an accident, as though love just happened to them between emails and hotel sheets. I took a slow sip of my wine. Pinot Noir, his favorite, not mine. I preferred white, but I'd been drinking his preferences for 7 years. I set the glass down gently, no drama, no trembling hands, and smiled. "Thank you for your honesty," I said, my voice even. "I know that must have taken courage." He blinked, slightly confused. Men like Daniel expect tears, screaming, perhaps a thrown plate for effect. They never expect composure. Inside, I felt nothing. That was the real tragedy of our marriage, not the betrayal, but the quiet death that came long before it. The night I realized I was married to a man who mistook my silence for devotion. Our dining room was a museum of restraint. Beige walls, soft light, expensive art that said nothing. The kind of place people photographed but never lived in. Daniel liked order, symmetry, control. He said chaos belonged to people without discipline. He never noticed that I'd already started creating my own kind of order, one that didn't include him. Every Thursday while he worked late, I attended charity luncheons, code for my private meetings with financial advisors. I'd been moving money for months, bit by bit, learning the language of investments he assumed I was too delicate to understand. He taught me architecture. I'd learned construction, but of a different kind. "Evelyn," he said suddenly, his voice softening, "I'll make sure you're comfortable. The house, the cars, we can figure it out. I don't want you to worry." I almost laughed. Comfortable, the word men use when they're preparing to bury you in silk. Instead, I nodded. "Of course," I said, "you've always been generous." He looked relieved. That's the thing about narcissists. They mistake grace for surrender. I watched him eat, unaware that I was already halfway gone, emotionally, legally, financially. The only thing I hadn't decided yet was whether I wanted to ruin him or simply erase him. Then I remembered Clara, his someone. The intern-turned-prodigy who wore perfume heavy enough to announce her before she entered a room. I'd seen the way she lingered at his office parties, the way his tone changed when she laughed. He thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything. As dinner ended, Daniel stood, adjusted his cufflinks, always the perfectionist, and said, "I'm glad we can handle this maturely." I stood too, letting my fingers trace the rim of my glass. "Of course, Daniel, you taught me how to be mature." He smiled, kissed my cheek, and walked away, certain he'd just executed the most graceful breakup in history. I watched his reflection disappear down the hall, the sound of his footsteps fading into the silence he left behind. Then finally I allowed myself a real smile. Because he thought he was ending something. And I knew I was just beginning. When he told me he wanted a divorce, I smiled, because I'd already divorced him in my mind 2 years ago. Part 2, the blueprint of control. People often said my husband was a man of vision. They said it with admiration, as if the way he arranged buildings on a skyline meant he understood how to build a life. Daniel believed in symmetry. In control. In things that stayed exactly where he placed them. Our home was a reflection of him. Cold marble floors that echoed when I walked barefoot, glass tables that showed every fingerprint, and neutral walls that refused to feel like home. He called it minimalism. I called it silence wearing an expensive suit. He liked to remind people that chaos was for the undisciplined. But I'd started to wonder if control was just chaos in a tailored jacket. After the night of his confession, the neat, practiced speech about outgrowing each other, Daniel became lighter, almost cheerful. He whistled while shaving. He sent flowers to my dressing room like a man performing good behavior. He talked to me about new beginnings and said things like, "I'll always care for you." That was the funniest part. He truly believed I still needed his care. I watched him the way a scientist studies a specimen, detached, curious, quietly amused. He was predictable, and predictability is the most dangerous thing a man can offer a woman who's thinking. In the mornings I played my part. Coffee the way he liked it, strong, no sugar. Toast cut diagonally. The same routine he mistook for devotion. He'd kiss my forehead on his way out, smell faintly of cedarwood and ambition, and leave his empire humming behind him. I'd stand by the window and watch his car disappear down the long drive, the taillights bleeding red against the grey morning. And that was when my real day began. Every Thursday he thought I was at yoga. He'd even remind me not to push myself too hard, the way men talk when they think they're being considerate. But instead of stretching on a mat, I'd sit in a corner cafe downtown, the kind with rain-streaked windows and soft jazz humming through hidden speakers. I'd open my laptop and log into an account under my maiden name, Evelyn Grace. Grace, the name I'd nearly forgotten I owned. It felt like touching an old scar and realizing it had healed quietly beneath your skin. My advisor, a quiet man named Leland, never asked questions. He assumed I was a widow managing inherited funds. I didn't correct him, let men believe what flatters their imagination. Each month I transferred small, unnoticeable amounts from our joint account. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger Daniel's suspicion. Just enough to grow into something formidable over time. He once told me, laughing over dinner, "I make sure you're comfortable, Eve, you'll never have to worry about money." He had no idea he was financing my independence. While he drafted blueprints for skyscrapers, I built my own designs, invisible ones. Connections, investments, a network of people who underestimated me. At charity luncheons, I listened instead of spoke. I learned which board members hated Daniel's arrogance, which clients felt sidelined, which women whispered about his flirtations behind expensive cocktails. People told me things they shouldn't have. I learned early that power doesn't always belong to the loudest in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the one who keeps refilling their glass. And so I listened. I collected names, details, weaknesses. Not because I wanted revenge, not yet, but because knowledge felt like oxygen after years of holding my breath. One evening, I stood in the doorway of Daniel's home office. He hadn't noticed me. He rarely did when his mind was building something grander than the room he stood in. Blueprints were spread across the desk, the lines sharp and deliberate under the lamplight. He moved his pencil with the precision of a man convinced the world would obey him if he just drew it correctly. "You love those," I said quietly. "Your blueprints, they're predictable." He looked up, surprised I'd spoken, then smiled in that smug, polished way he did when he thought he was being patient. "That's the point, darling, precision, control, every line has a reason." I smiled back. "Of course chaos doesn't suit you." He chuckled, "Chaos is for people without discipline." I tilted my head. "Or for people who learn to hide it well." His pencil paused just for a fraction of a second. Then he laughed a little too loudly and went back to his drawing. But I saw it, that flicker of unease. The faint tremor of someone who doesn't like being read. That night, long after he'd fallen asleep, I walked through the penthouse barefoot. The marble was cold under my feet. The city outside glowed gold and white, its lights blurring against the glass like fireflies caught in a jar. I passed through the living room, the kitchen, the gallery hallway filled with art he'd chosen, abstract shapes, perfectly balanced colors. Everything symmetrical, everything soulless. When I reached his office, I stopped. The blueprints still lay on the desk, untouched. The lamplight made the paper glow faintly, rows of lines, angles, measured perfection. Beside them, I placed a single blank sheet of paper. No grids, no boundaries, no rules. Then I picked up his drafting pencil, heavy, silver, engraved with his initials, and drew one clean line through the center of the page. A break. A fracture. The first deliberate crack in his perfect world. Here where it starts to break, I whispered. The sound of the pencil scratching paper was almost satisfying. I set it down gently, turned off the light, and stood there for a moment, just long enough to see his empire reflected in the dark glass of the window. People think revenge begins with rage. It doesn't. It begins with clarity, the quiet moment you realize the life you've been living was just someone else's design. And you finally start drawing your own. Because while Daniel built towers of glass and steel, I was building something far more precise. A plan made of silence, patience, and inevitability. And the cruelest irony of all, he was the one who taught me how to build it. Part 3, the woman he underestimated. Clara Mayfield was exactly the kind of woman Daniel liked to hire. Fresh-faced, efficient, and just naive enough to mistake his attention for mentorship. I'd seen her before, of course, at company events, hovering near him with the shy composure of a girl pretending she wasn't auditioning for someone else's life. She was the type who called her heels painfully worth it and her ambition a little secret. When Daniel introduced us formally, he looked almost proud, as though he were presenting me with an architectural prototype. "Evelyn, you've met Clara, haven't you? She's doing incredible work on the Lakeshore project." He said it like a man describing his own brilliance through another person. Clara smiled, all dimples and discomfort, clearly unsure if she should curtsy or shake my hand. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "I'm sure you have," I replied, smiling just enough for her to feel safe. She was beautiful in a nervous, unfinished way, the kind of beauty that trembles under fluorescent lights but glows in flattery. Her lipstick was too pink, her laugh too quick. I used to be her once, before I learned that charm is just camouflage for people who don't yet know their power. We spoke politely. About architecture, about Daniel's work ethic, about how inspiring he was. The satire wrote itself. "He's brilliant," she said. "It's amazing to learn from someone like him." "Yes," I said, "he's taught me so much about construction." I let that hang in the air. Mostly how to tear things down properly. She laughed, uncertain whether it was a joke. Daniel didn't notice. Men rarely do when a woman hides a blade inside a compliment. Later, at the office's charity gala, Clara approached me alone. She smelled like roses and nerves. Her dress was expensive but wore her, not the other way around. "I just wanted to say," she began, clutching her clutch as if it were a moral anchor. "You're so kind. If I were in your place, I don't think I'd handle things this gracefully." I tilted my head slightly, letting the chandelier light catch the smile I'd perfected over years of pretending. "Oh, I'm not kind," I said. "I'm patient. People confuse the two." Her eyes widened a little, that flicker of recognition, the realization that maybe the wife wasn't as oblivious as everyone assumed. "He talks about you," she said softly, trying to recover. "He says you're the calm in his chaos." I murmured, "And what does he say about you?" She blushed, a guilty pink that spread too easily across her cheeks. "Nothing really, we just understand each other." "Of course you do," I said. "Every man needs someone to make him feel understood, especially when his wife actually does." She smiled tightly, realizing too late that she'd walked into a conversation designed to expose her. But I didn't twist the knife, not yet. It was too early for blood. Instead, I placed a hand gently on her arm, the universal gesture of female solidarity, and whispered, "Enjoy this phase, Clara. It's the sweetest part, the pretending, the secrecy, the illusion that you're special." She froze. "I didn't mean..." "Oh, you don't have to explain," I interrupted softly. "I've been where you are. I know how intoxicating it is to believe you're the exception." Her lips parted, but no words came. And that silence, that delicious, trembling silence, was the sound of power shifting hands. When I returned home that night, Daniel was already asleep. I watched him for a moment, the peaceful face of a man who believed he had both women exactly where he wanted them. I almost admired the symmetry. Then I opened my vanity drawer and pulled out a thin folder labeled Lakeshore Holdings. Inside, copies of contracts, correspondence, small inconsistencies he'd never notice, until I made sure someone else did. I smiled at the reflection of myself in the mirror. Not the practiced hostess smile, the real one. The kind that comes when you realize the war you're fighting is already halfway won. They say women are dangerous when they have nothing to lose. I disagree. We're at our most dangerous when we finally realize what we stand to gain. Part 4: The Silent Empire. Control, I've learned, doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't arrive with noise or drama. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as routine, courtesy, patience. Daniel believed he was the architect of our lives. In truth, I was the foundation beneath it, and I'd already started redrawing the lines. While he busied himself perfecting other people's skylines, I built something far more durable: my network. It began innocently enough. A lunch here, a polite conversation there. A whisper of opportunity to the right person, and an artful silence to the wrong one. Soon, people started remembering my name, not just as Daniel's wife, but as Evelyn Grace, the investor who never needed to be introduced twice. I became the woman people leaned in to listen to. And I never had to raise my voice to be heard. Every empire begins with observation. Mine started in Daniel's office. While he was on late-night calls, I'd tidy up, casually flipping through his notes and schedules. He never noticed that I began reorganizing them, subtly. A meeting moved a day earlier, a call slightly delayed, a contact quietly replaced. Tiny cracks, barely visible, but cracks all the same. By the time he started missing appointments, it looked like carelessness, not sabotage. "You've been distracted lately," I'd say softly over dinner. "You should take a break, love." He'd sigh, rub his temples, and mutter something about staff errors. And I'd smile, sipping my wine. Yes, staff can be so unreliable. Clara was still fluttering in his shadow then, wide-eyed, hopeful, unsteady. Sometimes I'd see her name in his messages when his phone lit up beside him. He'd tilt it away, discreetly, like a magician hiding a cheap trick. Men always underestimate how much women can see through the smallest gestures. I never confronted him. Confrontation gives your opponent the illusion of relevance. Instead, I stayed silent, long enough for him to start mistaking comfort for loyalty. He told me once in bed, "You're my calm, Evelyn, you make everything make sense." I almost laughed. If only he knew how much chaos I had to orchestrate to make him feel that way. My days became a choreography of quiet control. By morning I was the poised wife, fresh coffee, linen blouse, unbothered smile. By noon I was the strategist, reshaping investments, meeting lawyers, building invisible alliances. By night I was the ghost haunting Daniel's perfectly ordered life, rewriting its symmetry one decision at a time. And he didn't suspect a thing. He thought I was healing. He thought forgiveness had softened me. Poor man, he didn't realize forgiveness was just my favorite disguise. One evening, at a small private dinner with investors, I saw Clara again, seated across from me, glowing with that particular light women wear when they think they've won. Her hand brushed Daniel's under the table. She thought I didn't see. I smiled at her, the kind of smile women use to tell each other I know. "You've been so helpful to Daniel lately," I said, lifting my glass. "He's always admired your dedication." Her cheeks flushed, her lips curved, she took the bait. "He pushes me to do better," she said softly. "He believes in my potential." "I'm sure he does," I replied, swirling the wine. "He has such a gift for inspiring young talent." I let my gaze rest on her. Until they learn they were only ever part of the blueprint. The table fell into a polite silence. Daniel laughed awkwardly, changing the subject. But the air had shifted just slightly, enough for her to feel it. That night while he showered, I walked to his office and looked again at his projects, those immaculate towers, those fragile dreams built on steel and ego. I whispered almost affectionately, "You're building monuments, Daniel, I'm building legacies." Then I closed the folder and locked the drawer, not his, mine. Because by the time the first crack showed in his empire, I wanted every witness to believe it was gravity that brought him down. Not me. They say behind every successful man is a woman. But behind every fallen one, there's a woman who finally learned how to build without asking permission. Part 5, Fault Lines. The first sign of collapse wasn't loud. It never is. Disaster begins as a murmur, the whisper of something shifting beneath polished floors. In our case, it was a missed call. Then a second. Then a meeting Daniel swore he'd confirmed, but somehow wasn't on the calendar anymore. He blamed his assistant. Then his project manager. Then eventually himself, though even that sounded rehearsed. "I've been stretched thin lately," he said one morning, staring into his black coffee like it held answers. "You've been distracted," I replied softly. He sighed, shoulders sagging. "Maybe Clara's been handling more of the Lakeshore coordination. She's reliable." That word reliable hung in the air like smoke. I smiled faintly. "I'm sure she is." The Lakeshore project was supposed to be his masterpiece. A sprawling complex by the water, all glass and arrogance. He called it a reflection of modern resilience. I called it fragile vanity with plumbing. By the time the first investor pulled out, Daniel was still convinced it was a misunderstanding. By the time the second did, his tone changed, clipped, defensive, frantic. And when the third demanded to see the revised structural report, he realized he didn't have one. Because I'd made sure he didn't. I remember standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of our living room that night, watching the city below, its towers gleaming like watchful sentinels. Behind me, Daniel paced the length of the room, muttering into his phone, his voice strained. He used to command rooms. Now he was arguing with receptionists. "They're overreacting," he snapped. "There's no discrepancy, well, not a serious one." I turned from the window, slow and deliberate, holding my wine glass like a prop. "What kind of discrepancy?" He waved me off. "Technical, nothing to worry about." "Then why do you look worried?" He glared briefly, the kind of glare that said he'd forgotten who taught him composure. "Evelyn, please, not tonight." I nodded, smiling serene. "Of course not, love, not tonight." Then I turned back to the window, where our reflections shimmered against the city's lights, him, restless and unraveling. Me still uncertain. A perfect symmetry breaking apart before my eyes. Over the next weeks, the fault lines widened. Emails went missing. Contracts returned unsigned. The board began whispering. Clara, poor thing, tried to help. She came by one afternoon while Daniel was out, in a soft blue dress, carrying a folder, eyes full of panic she couldn't quite hide. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. He's not himself." I studied her for a moment, knotting the trembling hands, the mascara smudged from stress, the perfume trying too hard to disguise fear. "Crisis looks different on everyone," I murmured. "Some scream, some build." She blinked. "I just want to fix it." "Of course you do," I said, pouring tea. "Every good apprentice does." She didn't catch the irony. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. It was hard to tell whether she feared me or admired me. Both emotions look similar when you're losing control. That night, Daniel sat at the edge of the bed, silent. The glow from his phone flickered over his face, emails, losses, questions he couldn't answer. "They're calling for an audit," he said finally. "You'll handle it," I said. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "Everything's falling apart." I turned to him slowly, studying the man who once walked through life like it belonged to him. Now he looked smaller, edges softened by doubt. I wanted to feel pity. But pity is just empathy without accountability. "Then perhaps," I said gently, "you shouldn't have built it on sand." He looked up, startled, the faintest realization that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't referring to the project. That night I lay awake beside him, the moonlight sketching pale silver lines across our sheets. His breathing was uneven, shallow, restless. Mine was. I thought about the empire he'd built, the one I was slowly, methodically reconfiguring, not to destroy him but to prove a point. Men build to be admired. Women rebuild to survive. And somewhere in between those two instincts lies the quiet power they'll never understand. When I closed my eyes, I could still see his blueprints in my mind, perfect lines, Precise angles, everything measured and controlled. Until someone drew just one diagonal slash across the middle. I smiled. Fault lines, after all, don't destroy structures immediately. They wait. They grow. They whisper first before the world finally hears them roar. The thing about control is this: it doesn't crumble all at once. It fractures quietly, until one morning you wake up and realize the cracks were never beneath your feet. They were beneath his. Part 6: Glass and Smoke. Scandals, like smoke, always find their way out. No matter how beautiful the room, or how tightly the windows are shut, the scent lingers, announcing itself to everyone too polite to ask. It began on a Tuesday. I remember because Daniel always wore his navy suit on Tuesdays, for confidence, he once said. That morning he looked confident enough, polished, composed, a man still convinced the world admired him. By evening, the headlines had rewritten his story. Lakeshore Scandal, CEO under fire for mismanagement and internal conflict. Insiders question structural integrity and financial transparency. Whispers of impropriety in leadership circles. It was almost poetic. He'd spent years designing skylines, now his own name was collapsing across them. I found him in the living room, phone buzzing incessantly, his voice hoarse from explanations no one wanted anymore. "It's blown out of proportion," he muttered. "They're twisting everything." "Of course they are," I said softly, setting a glass of water beside him. "That's what smoke does, it distorts what's underneath." He stared at me, eyes bloodshot, desperate for comfort he didn't deserve. "Evelyn, you believe me, don't you?" I looked at him for a long time. At the man who had once called my silence submission. At the same mouth that had whispered lies with the same confidence it now used to beg. "Belief," I said, "is a luxury for people who haven't seen the truth up close." He blinked, unsure if it was an insult or a revelation. The next morning, reporters gathered outside the building. Flashing cameras, eager faces, voices rising like birds in a storm. "Mrs. Hale, do you have a statement about the allegations? Did your husband misuse investor funds? How is your marriage handling the pressure?" I smiled politely, the way I'd been taught to, lips soft, eyes calm, chin steady. "My husband is a talented man," I said evenly, "and every storm reveals what was already weak." It was the kind of line that sounded supportive until you thought about it twice. The cameras loved it. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. Board members packing, phones ringing. Clara, poor, trembling Clara, sat in the corner, eyes swollen from tears, mascara streaking like confession ink. She looked at me as I entered, her mouth opening, closing. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Of course you didn't," I said. "No one ever means to fall into the fire, they just like playing near the matches." Her shoulders sagged. "He said he'd fix it, he said we'd be okay." "He's been saying that for years," I murmured, "to everyone." Then I leaned closer, just enough for only her to hear. "You wanted to be seen, Clara, congratulations, the whole city's watching now." Her breath hitched, and for the first time she truly saw me, not as the wife, not as the rival, but as the architect of silence who'd already drawn the final line. That evening, Daniel's board voted to suspend him, pending investigation. He came home late, defeated, untied, smaller. He dropped his jacket on the chair, poured himself a drink, and said nothing for a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I set my book down, meeting his gaze. "Enjoyment implies surprise. I'm simply watching the inevitable." "You think this is funny," he snapped. "No," I said, "I think it's poetic." He stared at me then, truly stared, as though realizing for the first time that the woman beside him wasn't a bystander. She was the author. Later that night, when the city quieted, I stood by the window again, watching the smoke rise from the skyline. His towers still stood for now. But I knew what came next. Glass fractures beautifully. It doesn't scream when it breaks, it sings. And somewhere beneath the hum of the city, I could already hear the first notes of that melody. They say every empire burns differently. His burned with headlines and silence. Mine with precision. If you've ever watched someone get exactly what they deserve, quietly, gracefully, and in full view of the world, make sure you subscribe. Because the next part is where he learns what real ruin feels like. Part 7: Ash and Architecture. After the fire, no one ever looks at the ashes. They rush to rebuild, to assess, to mourn, but no one kneels to study what's left behind. I did. I always do. The morning after Daniel's suspension, the city seemed quieter. The kind of quiet that hums, not rests. Even the sky felt muted, a pale grey ceiling pressing down on everything beneath it. The newspapers had stopped calling, the investors hadn't. I watched Daniel's phone light up on the counter again and again, buzzing like an unwanted conscience. He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring into nothing, the hollow eyes of a man who finally realized the world could move on without him. They've started the audit, he said dully. They'll find inconsistencies. I don't even know where half of them came from. I took a sip of my tea. Inconsistencies rarely appear out of nowhere. They grow quietly like mold. He rubbed his temples. I trusted the wrong people. You trusted everyone but yourself, I said softly. And worse, you trusted that no one was watching. He looked up then, eyes clouded with something almost like fear. You sound like you knew this was coming. Didn't you? I asked. He didn't answer. In the following weeks, our penthouse became a mausoleum of ambition. Curtains stayed drawn, the television spoke to itself. Sometimes I'd catch Daniel standing by the window, staring at the skyline he'd once ruled over, his reflection barely holding together. He still dressed the part, pressed shirts, clean cuffs, but there was no man inside the fabric anymore. When people fall, it's rarely from the height of their lies. It's from the shock of realizing they were never standing at all. Clara called once. Just once. Her voice was small, the kind that dissolves halfway through a sentence. I didn't know who else to talk to, she whispered. They're saying I leaked the documents, that I ruined everything. Did you? I asked. No. Then you'll be fine, I said. Truth has a way of protecting the innocent. There was silence, then. Do you think he'll forgive me? I let the question hang for a moment, watching the light fade across the marble floor. Forgiveness is a luxury for people who didn't participate, I said. You participated. She began to cry softly, the sound almost childlike. I listened, then hung up. Daniel tried to reach her later that night. When he couldn't, he smashed his phone against the floor, a small, pitiful burst of noise that echoed too loudly in the empty space. He turned to me, breathing hard. You think I deserve this, don't you? I folded the newspaper neatly. Deserve is such a moral word, I said. I prefer inevitable. He stared at me for a long time, searching for a trace of empathy, a fragment of the woman he'd once believed adored him unconditionally. But that woman was gone, buried beneath marble, glass, and the memory of 1,000 small humiliations he never even noticed he inflicted. That night I lit a candle. One of the little luxuries he used to mock. The flame flickered against the window, catching his reflection beside mine. He looked older now, smaller, hollowed out. I somehow looked clearer. You can start again, I said softly, almost kindly, from the ground up. With what? He asked. With humility, I said. It's lighter than steel, easier to rebuild with. He laughed, a brittle sound, half resentment, half exhaustion. You talk like you've already moved on. I have, I said simply. I just haven't left yet. That night I slept better than I had in months. Not because the war was over, it was. But because silence had finally become honest. They say ashes mean the end. But that's a lie. Ashes are what's left when truth finally burns hot enough to be seen. If you've ever watched someone's arrogance turn to dust, subscribe, because what comes next is no longer revenge. It's rebirth. Part 8: The Rebirth. Rebuilding doesn't start with blueprints. It starts with patience and the right kind of silence. The papers called it the Mercer collapse. I called it correction. Daniel's empire crumbled publicly, the way all man-made gods eventually do. Regulators froze assets, partners withdrew, and the staff whispered his name like it was contagious. He spent days fielding calls from lawyers, nights drafting apologies he never sent. Meanwhile, I planted seeds, quietly. While he spiraled, I began attending networking events, luncheons full of the city's polished wives and discreet investors. The kind of women who dressed like innocents but traded in ambition. They adored me. Pity, after all, is the most efficient disguise for power. Poor Evelyn, they'd whisper, she stood by him through everything. I smiled. One must, I'd say sweetly, men crumble faster when no one's watching. They'd laugh, delighted by my candor, mistaking satire for sincerity, as they always do. By the time dessert was served, I had 2 new partnerships and 3 quiet invitations to exclusive investor circles. It was almost too easy. When Daniel left for his wellness retreat, a euphemism for damage control, I moved into the study. The room smelled of leather, smoke, and failure. His ledgers sat half open, the screen still logged into the company's portal. I looked at the crest on the letterhead, that perfect serif M. And for the first time I didn't see Mercer. I saw mine. I didn't rebuild what he lost. I redesigned it. A new holding company, cleaner structure, sharper ethics on paper, sharper profits in reality. I used my maiden name for the signature, subtle but symbolic. It felt like shedding an old costume. Within months, whispers began again, this time about Evelyn Brand, the quiet investor making shockwaves in post-collapse sectors. They called me the ghost architect of the new market. No one realized the ghost was living in Daniel's old house. The satire of it all wasn't lost on me. Men destroy empires by chasing validation. Women rebuild them by pretending they don't care about it. Daniel returned thinner, quieter. He'd started using words like growth and reflection, the vocabulary of humbled men. He asked how I'd been. Busy, I said. Doing what? Learning how to build things properly. He smiled faintly, unaware of the irony sharpening every syllable between us. A week later, he saw my name in a headline, small but clear. Evelyn Brand joins consortium reshaping Mercer's former holdings. He read it 3 times. Then looked at me. You? Yes, I said simply. You used my name, my work. No, I interrupted, pouring myself a drink. I used what you left lying around. He stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. Maybe he was. You planned this, he whispered. No, I said, turning toward the window, the city lights flickering below. I learned this the hard way. I raised my glass slightly, my reflection shimmering beside his. To rebuilding, I said. Properly this time. He didn't drink. He just stood there, silent, small, irrelevant, while I smiled into the glass. Because sometimes rebirth isn't a phoenix rising. It's a woman standing perfectly still, while the ashes rearrange themselves around her. They said he built an empire. They were wrong. He built the stage. I just claimed the spotlight. If you've ever watched power return to its rightful owner, subscribe because the next part isn't revenge anymore. It's legacy. Part 9, the legacy. The thing about power is, it remembers who once ignored it. It may forgive, but it never forgets. A year passed. The Mercer name became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and business schools. Mine, Evelyn Brand, became a symbol of precision, restraint, and impossible calm. Funny, isn't it? How society calls a man resilient when he rebuilds, but a woman calculated when she does the same. I walked into rooms now where I used to pour drinks. Sat at tables where I once served apologies. The irony was delicious. The very investors who'd once pitied me now leaned in when I spoke, that slight forward tilt of the powerful pretending to be humble. Mrs. Brand, they'd say, your strategies are ruthless but elegant. I just believe in accountability, I'd reply with a smile, and a little irony. They'd laugh too loudly, too nervously. I always found that sound intoxicating. My company thrived. Every acquisition I made rewrote a line of my past. The properties Daniel once flaunted were now quietly absorbed under new management, mine. He never confronted me about it again. I think he finally understood that battles aren't always won in noise. Some victories are built out of paperwork and patience. One afternoon, the city awarded me the Reconstruction Achievement Medal. An unnecessary trinket, but an entertaining one. I wore a silk dress the color of champagne, the shade of celebration and pretense, and stood before the cameras as they applauded. Behind the lights, I saw faces from my old life. Men who'd once advised me to be supportive. Women who'd whispered that I was lucky. Now they called me visionary. It took everything in me not to laugh. In my speech, I thanked the collapse, not Daniel, not fate, but the fall itself. It taught me that ruin, I said, pausing as flashbulbs flickered, is simply an unsupervised opportunity. The room went silent, unsure whether to clap or confess. Then, slowly, they applauded. Louder than they ever had for him. After the ceremony, a journalist approached me. Young, ambitious, her recorder trembling slightly. "Mrs. Brand, people say your success came out of nowhere. How do you respond to that?" I smiled. "Nothing comes out of nowhere," I said softly. "It just waits for people to stop looking in the wrong direction." She nodded, wide-eyed. She thought she'd just witnessed grace. She hadn't. She'd witnessed balance restored. Later that night, I drove past the old Mercer building. The logo had changed, the name erased. But the glass still reflected my face, as if it recognized its architect. I parked for a moment, engine humming low, city lights rippling across the windshield. There was no satisfaction in it anymore, only symmetry. And silence, finally serving me instead of suffocating me. People think legacy is about what you leave behind. It is. It's about what refuses to forget you existed. They buried me in rumors. I built a monument out of the dirt. If you've ever been underestimated long enough to learn their language, subscribe, because the final part isn't about revenge or rebirth anymore. It's rule. Part 10, the rules. Power doesn't arrive with thunder. It seeps in softly until one morning, you wake up and realize everyone is waiting for your approval to breathe. It had been 3 years since the collapse. The city had rebuilt itself, glittering brighter than before, pretending not to remember the scandal that fed its progress. Pretending, as cities do, that reinvention was virtue, not camouflage. And at the center of it all, my company, Brand & Co., stood like glass made holy. Transparent enough to appear honest, sharp enough to draw blood. My mornings were measured in silence now. No more slammed doors, no raised voices. Just the hum of order, polished, curated, precise. Assistants moved through the marble corridors like whispers. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and ambition. Every decision I made rippled outward, shifting prices, altering forecasts, rearranging fates. It should have felt intoxicating. It didn't. It felt heavy. One afternoon, my new CFO, a quiet, clever woman named Mara, came into my office holding a folder. Her tone was careful, the kind of care that precedes truth. "We've had some unusual transactions," she said. "Old accounts resurfacing, offshore links, I traced them back to someone in-house." I looked up from my desk. "Who? Your husband?" I almost laughed. "Ex-husband," I corrected. She hesitated. "Technically no, the divorce wasn't finalized, the court delays." I leaned back, eyes on the skyline. "Of course," I said quietly, "he never signs anything unless it benefits him." That evening, I found Daniel waiting at the townhouse. The same man, different posture, desperate disguised as dignity. He'd aged like regret, unevenly. "You look tired," I said. "You've done well for yourself," he replied, forcing a smile. "Better than I expected." "You always underestimated me," I said. "It's your most consistent quality." He ignored the jab. "You built this on what I started." "No," I said, pouring myself a drink. "I built it on what you left in ruins." I want my share. I turned slowly, glass in hand. You already had it, you spent it. He stepped closer. Don't pretend you didn't use my contacts. My name opened those doors. Your name, I said, was the lock. I learned how to pick it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room was still except for the faint ticking of the clock, the same one he'd bought to symbolize timeless success. Now it sounded like countdowns. You can't erase me, Evelyn, he said softly. I don't have to, I replied. You've been fadding all on your own. He flinched, small but visible. And for the first time I felt nothing. Not triumph. Not pity. Just absence. After he left, I stood by the window again, the same window from the beginning, the skyline unchanged, but me unrecognizable. It hit me then, I'd become everything he once pretended to be. Unbothered, untouchable, necessary. And the world adored me for it. The satire of it all nearly made me laugh. Men destroy and are called bold. Women rebuild and are called cold. And yet both stories end the same, with someone standing alone at the top, realizing altitude and isolation are synonyms. Weeks later, Forbes ran a cover story. Evelyn Brand, the woman who redefined power. I stared at the headline longer than I meant to. The word power shimmered, pretty and hollow. I could almost hear Daniel's voice behind it, amused. You've finally become what you hated. Maybe he was right. Maybe the difference between revenge and rule was just the lighting. I closed the magazine, set it aside, and looked at my reflection in the glass wall opposite my desk. Composed, controlled, curated. A woman sculpted by circumstance and sharpened by betrayal. And yet, somewhere behind the polish, I saw the girl who once wanted love more than leverage. She looked at me with quiet accusation. Was it worth it? She asked silently. I didn't answer. Because the truth is, power isn't a crown. It's a mirror. And the longer you hold it, the more it reflects what you destroyed to get it. That night I went up to the rooftop, the city glittering below like temptation reincarnated. The wind was cool, the kind that whispers rather than moves. I lifted my glass to the skyline, the empire, the ashes, the irony. To rule, I murmured. To rebuild, to remember. The stars didn't answer. They never do. They said revenge was fire. They were wrong. It's architecture, elegant, deliberate, and always under renovation. If you've ever rebuilt yourself so perfectly, the world mistook it for grace. Subscribe because every empire has a ghost story. And sometimes the ghost is still watching. Epilogue: The Architect. They say time heals. I don't think it does. It only reorganizes the pain into prettier shapes. 10 years. That's how long it's been since the Mercer collapse, the scandal, the whispers, the empire that rose from its ashes like a well-dressed ghost. The world has changed. Names fade faster now. Empires are digital, collapses trend before they're understood. But my name, Evelyn Brand, still lingers. It shows up in magazines, case studies, and whispered conversations about strategy and discipline, words they use when they're too afraid to say revenge. I live in the countryside now. Far enough from the city to forget its noise, close enough to still feel its pulse at night. The house is modern, glass, cedar, quiet luxury. Designed to look effortless, but nothing about it is. Just like me. I spend my mornings walking through the orchard I planted the year the company hit its peak. Every tree is symmetrical, every branch intentional. The gardeners joke that I manage trees the way I ran my boardroom, pruning early, rewarding growth, cutting rot before it spreads. They're not wrong. Sometimes, when the light hits the glass house just right, I see my reflection doubled, Evelyn Mercer and Evelyn Brand staring back at each other. Neither smiles. Both survived. Daniel is gone. Heart failure, they said. He'd remarried briefly, she left before the funeral. The papers ran his obituary beside mine, the visionary and his muse. The irony nearly made me laugh. In the end, they still framed me as an accessory to his legend, not the author of it. But then again, history has always been edited by comfortable men. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent lilies, his mother's favourite, not his. And a note that read, "Some things bloom too late to be forgiven." After that, I stopped taking calls. The company runs itself now, under a board of women sharper than any army of men I've ever met. They don't ask for approval, they just inform me when they've broken another ceiling. Sometimes I watch them on television, polished, articulate, fearless, and I smile. They have no idea how much I sacrifice to make their confidence look natural. At dusk, I often sit by the pond at the edge of the property. It's perfectly still, reflecting everything above it, a flawless mirror of chaos disguised as calm. Much like I've been all my life. I think about the woman I used to be, the one who cooked dinners while her husband lied, who smiled through humiliation and built blueprints from betrayal. She doesn't feel like me anymore. She feels like a story I tell in the third person. Maybe that's the final cost of power. You stop being the protagonist. You become the myth. Once a journalist tracked me down, young, eager, shaking slightly as she handed me her recorder. "Mrs. Brand," she said, "after everything, do you regret it?" I looked at her, really looked, at the hunger in her eyes, the ambition wrapped in politeness. I saw myself. "No," I said finally. "Regret is for people who didn't finish what they started." She smiled, thinking she'd captured a quote. She hadn't. She captured a warning. When night falls, I light one candle, always one, and stand by the window overlooking the dark stretch of land I now call peace. The flame flickers, small but unyielding. I think about everything it took to get here. Every humiliation, every silence I weaponized, every mask I wore until it became my face. And then I think of something Daniel once said. "You sound like you knew this was coming." I did. I just didn't know it would cost this much peace to own it. They'll tell my story one day, the wrong way, of course. They'll call it resilience, strategy, even luck. But it was none of those things. It was precision. And I never missed a line. If you've ever turned pain into architecture, if you've ever learned to build quietly until the world had no choice but to look up, subscribe to Everyday Dramas, because this isn't the end of Evelyn Brand. It's the beginning of every woman who learned how to rise beautifully.